Hi, I'm Janis.
And I'm Darren.
And this is Event Horizon. So all of us here, Darren and I, as well as all of you tuning in today, know that 2025 and beyond is poised to be an utterly wild ride. Today, we're going to dive into what remote viewers are seeing and saying about what's on the horizon as we enter this monumental year and moment. So, Darren, I'm wondering if you can start us off by summarizing what different remote viewers are saying about the future, specifically about recent events involving the drones and the orbs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is interesting to start here because many people look at certain kinds of data to try to make sense of what's going on. They listen to the media, they listen to different military officials giving their take on these things, and they have certain ufologists they might pay attention to. But of course, you and I know that another stream of data is these remote viewers, incorporating psi protocols to try to find out not only what's happening now, but where it might be going as well. So this is something we absolutely track. And as we've been saying all along, and as I have said on Point of Convergence since I first started that, all of these things converge together somehow, not only in terms of speaking to each other, but also describing some sort of monumental moment. And here we are in this event horizon right after entering 2025. So yes, when it comes to remote viewers and this particular matter of the drones and the orbs, there are, of course, many different kinds of remote viewers, different groups, but the two we're going to focus on mainly that have gotten a lot of attention is Bertie Jaworski's take on what's happening here, as well as the Farsight Institute's and Courtney Brown's take on what's happening. There's some overlap in those two, and there's some divergence as well. And one of the things we'll get into is how to even make sense of that when two different groups end up with two different descriptions of where this is going, even when there is some overlap. So let me begin by an overview of Bertie's description. So what's great about this is that she actually videoed the whole thing. So those of you who have not seen it, I would encourage you to look it up. She did it in 3 parts on different days, where basically this was a blind target. And then she just basically in real time processes what she's seeing. She uses this paper and colored pens and whatnot to doodle what she's seeing. And she'll write words, she'll write phrases, sentences, sometimes pictures, sometimes colors, and then tries to put it all together. So it's really fascinating to watch if you want to see what it looks like in real time. I know, Janis, you recently did a workshop with her, so I'd be interested to hear your take on that. But really quickly, to give people a sense of what was seen, Bertie basically saw this was non-human intelligence, though very interestingly, not a kind of intelligence that she's dealt with before. And as I pointed out on Liminal Frames, she's been in this for decades. So she's certainly encountered non-human intelligence before. But this was different, and so different that it actually made her slightly uncomfortable. She was unsettled. She kept saying, this makes me nervous, because it was so uncannily different. But what she sensed was this quantum scale kind of intelligence that was non-corporeal could manifest 3D objects at will. And that basically underneath the ocean, which again, a lot of the reports have said these things are coming up off the ocean, so that corroborates there. That underneath the ocean, there's this kind of vortex, this invisible vortex that served as a kind of wormhole, if you will, between here and some faraway place, some planet or some galaxy far, far away, basically. And that this information would come in, be downloaded, updated by this intelligence that was a bit like an artificial intelligence, though not exactly that. She wasn't quite sure how to describe it. But it would get an update based on information coming from this non-local source that was paired with what was happening here in our civilization. And then they would manifest these objects to basically follow some sort of protocol, some sort of agenda in the world. And that they were showing up in increasing numbers. And this was part of an intervention. This is the key point here, is that this intelligence has been watching us silently for a long, long time and believes that we're at this crux point now, that if they don't intercede, we may end up destroying ourselves, the planet, the biosphere, and all of that. There's also the sense that some major solar event is in the future. Now, Janis, that sounds totally new to me. I don't think we've talked about that at all. Of course, I'm joking because we have talked about this many times on this podcast. It is strange to me, as much as I'm familiar with these notions. I talk to new coaching clients, I talk to people I meet online, and this just comes up over and over again, this notion about some major event to do with the sun in the future. She saw that as well, and that they were here to help get us past a certain transition point that involves something massive happening with the sun. So that tracks with other information we've gotten. The notion was that this was going to increase and that it would lead to basically first contact eventually, is the notion here. So that's what she saw. Now let's quickly go through what Farsight saw. So Courtney Brown is the leader of Farsight. He's the founder of it. They are a group that has engaged in professional remote viewing protocols, and I'll get into later what the protocols are, but they've been doing this for decades as well. In fact, I think Courtney and Bertie worked together even decades ago, maybe back in the 90s, so they are familiar with each other. Now, what Courtney has said in a recent interview, very interestingly, was that basically he and his group, Farsight, have known about this far before it actually started manifesting. And that basically they were being prepared by non-human intelligence to also help facilitate some sort of intervention, some sort of first contact. And that they have known about this for a long time, but they were asked by this intelligence, this consortium of different kinds of NHI, to keep it on the down low. They would meet in secret locations on beaches and whatnot, get information, and eventually they would start showing up in things that look like orbs and drones, but they're actually not orbs and drones, which is not to say there aren't human drones in the mix, but there's also this non-human factor as well, and that they would increase their presence over time. And as many people know, one of the most compelling aspects of their argument is that they are basically going to be told things that will happen ahead of time, and then people will over time realize what they're saying is accurate because it will be confirmed by future events that confirm what they basically predicted was going to happen. So this non-human intelligence is giving them information about what's going to happen. It will happen, apparently. And then as people recognize that Farsight is onto something here, this will be part of the process by which we come into contact and relationship with non-human intelligence. A couple other points I want to make before I pass it on to you for some of your thoughts about those two takes. One is that Courtney made the point that it's not like these are the reptilians or these are the Greys and they're against the reptilians or the Nordics. He made the point that there are different factions made up of different species, but some of the same species represented in different factions. He, in a way that is not so comfortable for me, talks about good ETs, bad ETs. I prefer conversations around maturity and things like that, stages of consciousness. But what he calls the bad ETs are the ones that are nefarious. They are control structures. They basically want to dominate, and they have made accords with certain elites within human society, which of course very much comports with what David Grush reported when he came forward a couple of years ago. So the notion is this positive non-human intelligence that wants to see humankind step into our power is on the scene and helping inspire us. And he says that they are, quote unquote, free will fanatics, the good ones, I mean, in the sense that they don't want to just come in and fix the situation. They want to inspire us to step into our potential so that we save ourselves from ourselves with their help. So those are the two general takes. Janis, what's your response to both of those?
Well, I'm just going to add a few details that I'd noted when I was going through these that may be germane. So for birdies, I think one of the pieces that was interesting when I was re-listening to it was the idea that these replicate, right? That there are these, whatever it is that's coming here is replicating. That's one of the reasons we're seeing the spread. And it seems she talked about it as AI, but with sentience and some sort of networked mind. So it was an interesting fusion in her drawings between an AI-like thing that had sentience, that could quickly share information, and that could self-replicate sort of on-site. The other point that she made that I thought was interesting is a lot of us are wondering, what's going on up there? How many things are up there, and what are they, and what came first? She talks about her sense in her viewing was that it was mostly UAPs, but that there were one of the first hits she got was like a military helicopter. There were blades, definitely military or military adjacent kinds of things. But that the majority of what was going on up there that were UAPs and that they could mimic. And I know that's come up before, right? That they can mimic drones or they could mimic other kinds of craft. And that they're, whatever they are, she said, this is happening in places that they're increasing, and that they are sending information to the whole collective that then affects what's happening all over the world. What the nature of that communication was an interesting thing to watch her map, because she was really having a hard time. I think that was the third session, trying to figure out exactly what the communication was. But you talked about it related to the fate of our planet, basically. very concerned about where we are and feeling like we are on the brink potentially of something that may have to do with war in particular. She said she did not detect anything related to like nuclear materials. So that one narrative that has been going around potentially that, some of the military were looking for lost nuclear materials just didn't resonate with her. The Courtney Brown and Farsight version is kind of interesting. There's a lot of, we're going to talk about some of the convergence, so I won't go into a lot of that right here. But like you, I wasn't quite sure. I think that there's a larger dueling narrative. We both know that. Like, they're either humanity has gotten itself in a pretty big pickle and it's bad and they're going to need help in order to survive. That's one big bucket narrative. And then the other is there has been involvement with good ETs and bad ETs, and there are agreements and agendas. And, Courtney's point that you pointed out was there are factions within each of the groups, so it gets very complicated. And this goes back a long way, but basically the bad ETs have commandeered things, and, there needs to be an intervention in order to keep them from basically making humanity the prison planet idea, right? He used that term, as I recall, prison planet, which always kind of bugs me. So I'm hoping we could kind of dig into that one down the road. But I think one of the things that comes out of both of theirs is this idea that it's empirically testable. I'm glad for that as a scientist in particular. They both suggest that, we think that it's going to be becoming more prolific, more common. We'll know. We should know within months whether or not there's any merit to what either of them are saying. And of course, if it's, if what we're seeing is a really advanced Chinese tech, then it's basically an act of war. And I suspect we'll kind of figure that out. We'll know that too at some point. So the scientist in me is happy that we have some testable hypotheses, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. A falsifiable hypothesis is something scientists like. And we have this in both of these cases, especially I would say in Farsight's case, because to some degree it's already happened, you could argue. Although, statistically, maybe they got a fluke hit here. We'll find out with the next prediction. The first prediction that happened a few days before the drones and the orbs started showing up in greater numbers, beginning in New Jersey, then spreading around the world, they did predict something like that would happen. So that's one hit that you could say they got that right. Now, he says, don't trust me based on what I'm saying. Like, just watch what happens, because the NHI have made the point, we'll handle proving this to the world. You just need to report what we're telling to you. So what they told them that was going to happen next is there will be bigger craft showing up. So up until now, the largest thing has been kind of an SUV-sized drone, and that doesn't stretch credulity, right? Like, people can imagine drones that are about that size. But once you start seeing not necessarily mothership-sized things, but things are much bigger, maybe something the size of a football field or larger, if that starts showing up, then people go, I don't know that there's drones like that right now, especially if they're operating, moving very slowly and those kind of things with that kind of mass. So that's what they're saying is going to happen next. A couple of points I want to touch on that you brought up. One is to do with this notion of a prison planet, because one of the things we're going to talk about today is checking yourself for distortion, checking yourself for bias. There's numerous ways that comes up, and we'll touch on those. But one can be a simple matter where you just prefer one hypothesis over another, or you prefer one narrative over another because of your own life history or something. And this can make you pay attention to some data more than others, and you self-select the data, basically. I would have to say, I, just like you, absolutely check myself for that, and sometimes catch myself having a certain preference, and I see it over time. And I would say that I have resisted this notion of the prison planet. It's interesting, you said the same thing. It kind of irks you. It's not something you really want to embrace. And we recently had a conversation about this because I shared on Liminal Frames a really remarkable revelatory experience I had on Christmas Day after I followed this protocol. You know a little bit more than the public knows in terms of what happens to me. But basically, in addition to the things I have talked about, there's some elements I have not talked about publicly yet. One of them involved not just coming back and realizing this is not real, this is a construct, this is a kind of simulation-like reality, although I don't want people to jump to the Matrix or some sort of computer program necessarily, but some sort of construct. But in addition, the place, quote unquote, that I went to in between was very much like the source code level of this construct, so that when I collapsed back into this field and everything crystallized around me as objects and my cat, I assumed because of the experience that this was the direct rendering of the source code I had basically just experienced, which was very symbolic and that kind of thing. In addition to that, though, there was also this sense of nefariousness to this construct, that it was not just a neutral construct, that there was either something inherent to the construct itself or some sort of overlay that was in place that involved kind of a mass hypnotic effect, a way of blinding people from their potential, those kinds of things. And you, of course, know that we've discussed that on previous podcasts. This you were hinting at a few minutes ago. Have we ended up in this pickle, as you said, because of our own poor choices and the implications of late-stage capitalism? Or is it that there's some sort of elite group, perhaps not just human, but also non-human? We explored this in one of our earlier podcasts, that is deliberately, slowly but surely diminishing people, disempowering our ability to tune into our potential, because then we become more easily controlled. There is something to that in my experience on Christmas Day. So it has me looking at things a bit differently since then, I would have to admit. The last piece I want to share in terms of things I've noticed about Courtney and Farsight that I want to get your take on as well. Now, they did give a falsifiable hypothesis, but they also said that they are going to be the sole source of information. That's a bit of a red flag for us. When any person or group says, I've become the sole source of the information coming from the NHI, everything comes through me. It sounds like someone may be operating out of ego. Now, again, Farsight is an institute, is not just one person, and I will get to in a minute how they come to consensus decisions. It's not just what Courtney sees, but they have said that the ETs, the good ETs, don't want to confuse people. And because there are so many resources online, so many different takes, different opinions, they wanted people to eventually, over time, based on proof that was provided, know there's one source they can trust, an authoritative source that represents what they want to communicate to humanity. And Farsight believes that they are that authority. So what was your take on that and other things you've noticed?
Yeah, that one definitely raises a red flag. Although I have to admit that when Courtney explains it, I'm like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. But we'll see. That was my take. Like, we'll see. I'm not convinced. I mean, you and I've talked about this. I kind of feel like personally, and this isn't necessarily predicated on any particular set of data, it's just something that continues to show up in my own experiences of, contact experiences or anomalous experiences, is that I don't think any one of us or any one group of us has all the puzzle pieces. I think part of the point is that each of us have different parts of the puzzle pieces, and we have to work together to figure it out. I mean, and that makes a lot of sense, right? In terms of where I know there is consensus about where we're being pushed to go, which is something much more in alignment with seeing ourselves as a collective. We are as a whole fabric. We are one species. So there's a part of me that's like, yeah, when anybody claims to have the commanding piece of the puzzle or this puzzle board, I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I doubt it. But I also am always amazed at how elegant this design is, in the sense that I feel like I always get some little piece of it wrong, and then I'm go, oh, I see how that fits in now, but I didn't before. The question of a prison planet is an interesting one, and it brings me a lot of different places, because one of the first pieces of information when, as I've told you, and I think I've mentioned before on this program, that came in in 2018 when I was starting to get a lot of information. One of the very first sentences I heard in my head is, there is a control program in place. There has been for thousands of years, and it's ending now. And humanity is at a massive evolutionary moment, and it isn't just humanity. I saw this as a sentient Earth-driven experience, which would also tie in. There is a lot of consensus around the solar event. That's not humanity-driven, and it's probably not any entity-driven. That would be a cosmic pattern. That would be the flow of the universe doing its thing, right? Like every 12,000 years, our solar system goes through a certain particular place in the galaxy, and there are these things that happen, and they just happen. It's part of sort of the destiny of the planet. No entity can necessarily stop that. So that kind of stuff makes me think that there's a number of really converging things going on here, but that original idea that we are in a controlled situation in which there has been some infusion of probably less than ideal players doing less than ideal things, that they're not all human, and that the time has come because of this larger pattern for evolution, and that's going to have to be exposed and deconstructed, and humanity needs to be able to evolve, and that it's a natural process that's happening anyway. That is something that kind of makes sense. So the overlay of the prison planet idea on that does kind of fit, but I have a really hard time with the idea of a prison planet from a spiritual perspective, because my foundational spiritual experience and training suggests no soul can be imprisoned. Like your God consciousness. I can maybe agree at some soul level, but I fundamentally have a problem with that idea. But that's very macro. I think most people have a hard time thinking in such a large scale. I don't like the language because it makes us seem like victims, and I have an allergic reaction to victim anywhere. It's like it cannot be true. We are not victims. God is not a victim, and we're God. We're slivers of God. So that's where I wish that in some ways we would change the language to reflect something that's a little less scary.
Absolutely agreed on that, actually. And I really want to hit home on this point because, again, one of the major revelations that came out of that experience I had on Christmas Day was that this is just a story. We choose to identify with whatever story we want to identify with. If you end up being impacted and persuaded by fear, you might buy into that particular pattern, and then you start living from those principles. So one thing Courtney did say that I actually agreed with was that these beings can't kill you because you're indestructible. You are part of source consciousness. All they can basically do is deceive you. So to your point, to some degree, the prison planet only exists as long as you believe it exists. And if you actually tune into a different story and a deeper sort of fractal layer of yourself, you have absolute liberty and freedom and total agency, which isn't to say that some nefarious groups might not try to influence you or trip you up or distract you. They will. In fact, you and I have talked about this many times in this podcast, that the distractions are purposeful. They are meant to disempower you. So what we definitely both want to say to people here is don't retract in fear in light of what we're saying. Actually go the opposite direction. Step into your agency. Know your power. Absolutely. So this is something that we want to absolutely help people understand here. And that's a big part of what you and I both felt called to do with this podcast. And we'll, in the end of the show, get into some ways we can actually recommend certain practices we can use. But I also wanted to touch on a couple other things before we go into our next question to entertain. And the first one is the idea that the sun is conscious. So you said a second ago, this notion of some solar event. This is something else I think physicalism and mainstream Western civilization will have to get over. They think of us as consciousness, and then they say we are just a spark of consciousness as kind of a cosmic fluke because of a certain arrangement of matter that had no real purpose or intention behind it. But not only is that not true, and many people are tapped into that, but actually everything is an aspect of consciousness. And according to even other channel materials, speaking of psi, like the raw contact material, the sun is conscious. Every solar and galactic body is conscious. And actually, interestingly, Rupert Sheldrake wrote a paper not long ago asking, is the sun conscious? And it's important to keep that in mind because even when we talk about these solar events, and you touched on this, but I just really want to highlight this, that even when these things arise in our future, they're not happenstantial. They're not quote unquote natural disasters. There is no such thing. There's no such thing as coincidence. These are all matters that you and I keep repeating here. It takes a while to get into this way of seeing and experiencing and being. Those are some things I think are really key before we move on to the next part. Before I get into some of the protocols that Farsight follows, I know you have a couple thoughts you'd like to share.
Yeah, I just really want to quickly say, I mean, when the first piece of information came in about a control program and stuff and human evolution, and this is all, it's just time. I was like, it's just time. And I was also told there is a battle going on, but it's a battle for consciousness. But the overarching sense I had coming away with it was like, well, you can dangle a stick. You want to try to make me afraid? Fair. That's fair game. It's like a game. It's not. It's on me. It's on me to say, I gotcha. No, I'm not going to do that. And that's where working with mind and all, some of the stuff we'll get to at the end is really important. I'm not a victim to it. And anything in the universe is perfectly allowed to try to entice me away. And it makes me stronger to have to learn how to turn my gaze away or to how to redirect the energy that's coming to me in some way. So I think that's where I feel like we really are going to have to go as a species. We're going to have to really deal with this tendency to see ourselves as being acted upon rather than engaged with. it's like a dance, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the end about things to do, because I got some really great advice a few months ago around dealing with fear and big scary monsters, that has proven to be quite helpful for me, as some of those things have entered my life at one point or another. But maybe we should jump into the question you just left us off with.
To transition to that, I first want to talk about some of the protocols that Farsight employs, because this is important to differentiate here the message from the messenger. I'm going to be pretty transparent here and say I don't think Courtney Brown is a particularly mature individual. I see some parts of him that are still operating with a fair degree of distortion. But nevertheless, Farsight itself has some pretty serious protocols, pretty well set up to basically account for and prevent distortion from coming into the field. And as I touched on earlier, it's not just Courtney doing this reading, it's multiple people and they come to consensus. So I want to fill people in a bit about what their protocol is like, and that will transition into our conversation where it's going to go next in terms of why should we trust these kind of protocols to begin with. So the first protocol that is key is that it's a blind target. So remote viewers are not given any information about the target beforehand. That's really important because sometimes people go, well, maybe they're just inferring certain things or deducing things well, but it's a blind target. Many people will sometimes think, like it was the case in the olden days, when it's, say, the Eiffel Tower, they think they will get coordinates, latitude and longitude, but actually they don't even get that anymore. They basically just get a reference number and that's it. The rest is just a blind target. Second, as I hinted about a few minutes ago, there are multiple viewers. This is Farsight itself. Farsight employs multiple trained remote viewers to work independently on the same target. So they're not looking over each other's work and cheating on their essay or whatever. They're actually doing this independently. Only afterwards do they compare notes. The Institute trains viewers in techniques based on methodologies developed during the U.S. government's remote viewing programs, such as controlled remote viewing, CRV, and scientific remote viewing, SRV. And just to clarify here, these are very specific protocols that were very rigid in terms of how they were implemented and practiced by the U.S. military because they wanted something that was military grade in terms of its predictability. So we'll get to some of that later. Another key aspect of Farsight's process is they work towards a consensus around data. So data from multiple viewers is analyzed collectively to identify consistent patterns or descriptions. Discrepancies are noted, but a strong emphasis is placed on overlapping elements to build a coherent picture of the target. They believe that cross-referencing descriptions from different viewers reduces the likelihood of noise or inaccuracies, or what you would call, and I would call, distortion. There's also recording of the sessions. This is key. You can go to their website and you can actually see the recordings of their sessions, audio and video. So that's very transparent, and we would both champion that. The remote viewing sessions are often video recorded to ensure transparency and provide a detailed account of the viewer's experiences, so they can't be changing it after the fact. You're seeing it in real time. These recordings are shared with the public in many of Farsight's projects, allowing external review. Analysis and interpretation. The data is compiled into reports or visual reconstructions. Courtney Brown and other analysts interpret the data, connecting it to historical or current events. Interpretations sometimes include speculative or unconventional conclusions, especially regarding extraterrestrial or metaphysical topics. That's not so unusual for you and I, but maybe for the average public, that's a bit of a stretch. And finally, validation through predictions. This has to do with what he talked about, where he said basically, they've said what's going to happen. If we're right and they're right, it'll happen. If it doesn't happen, you can dismiss us. So Farsight occasionally conducts projects aimed at predicting future events to test the accuracy of the remote viewing techniques. Predictions are documented and later compared with real-world outcomes. As we transition to this next section here, let me ask you, when people come to you that have no history with psi, no history with extraterrestrials, they deal in conventional logic and conventional understanding, what would you say to them in terms of why they should take remote viewing seriously to begin with?
Just going to be candid. I mean, as a scientist, I've worked with obviously lots of scientists, and people who are closed off to the idea, there's nothing I can say to them typically. And I've had multiple experiences of handing people academic papers, like Daryl Bem. We talked about him feeling the future, and then he did a great meta-analysis, I think, a few years later, and all the work that IONS does. I mean, there's some really solid science out there. What I've been most amazed by, honestly, and what I've studied the most in some ways informally, is just what determines whether a mind is open or closed. So I don't really typically try to tell them that it is. If I'm going to, however, I would probably start with association. It was developed by the CIA. It is a technique that comes right out of there. It's a technique that is replicated by governments all over the world because it's really effective. And there's been ongoing psychic spy programs in our government and other governments for now decades. In this case, I suspect that there's a reason for that. We all would. And that there's a very broad now and growing body of science that helps us to understand the mechanisms. I think there's a lot of convergence around the idea that this isn't a linear material reality. And we've talked a lot about that on the Event Horizon, so I'm not going to go into that too much, but that's what I would lean on. And then from there, I typically go where I go with people who are open is you're doing it all the time. Everybody does it. They just don't know it. And that becomes easier because then I can usually help them see where they do it. It's not that hard. None of us out the gate are going to be like a Birdie or Courtney and his team or other, Russell Targ or those folks who've been doing it for a while. But we all use it all the time. And almost everybody, if they really think about it, can find examples of things that they saw in advance or things they knew about their partner or their kids in advance, or somebody died and they knew that something had happened or they got a visitation. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which people are using that second sight, so to speak. I think that where it gets interesting for me is in how do you move from being an average person? And this is something Birdie says a lot that I really appreciate, from being an average person to somebody who can be pretty good at it. Her contention is anybody can learn to be a remote viewer. Maybe not everybody's going to be phenomenal. There are standouts, right? But she contends that she can teach anybody to be a remote viewer because there's a systematic way to learn how to interpret your own mind's signals. And that's really what it comes down to. Your extended mind, let us say, is constantly feeding you back information, usually in response from a human perspective. We don't have outside targets, just to a question that we might pose. And as soon as you pose a question, usually most of us, if we pay attention, we're getting some sort of hit on an answer, like a sense of. My sense is. Well, where? How'd you get that sense? Start there. And then you go out from there in terms of learning how to interpret the kinds of information that is coming back, how to turn your gaze there. And then how, in the class I took with her, it was really how do you basically take that process. And she has there's these very systematic ways of kind of unpacking it. And then how do you take that process, unpack it, and then focus your gaze, your second sight on the details, which takes sustained attention. One of the things Birdie said that I thought was so interesting when we were learning from her was it takes a lot of calories. Like you lose weight when you're remote viewing a lot. And I was like, after 5 days of remote viewing with her, I'm like, I totally get that. It really does use a kind of muscle that we don't think of as a muscle, but that burns a lot of energy and does take effort. I found myself in the process of the 5 days sometimes resisting. I'm like, enough already. I don't want to focus there. It's hard. And I'm like, this is that muscle she was talking about. And I did find that as I did it more, as we practiced more, I could see more. And her contention is practice, practice, practice. That's what it's all about. It's not about something you don't have. It's just about learning to decode your mind, the information, learning how your mind may create symbols, and they're different than anybody else's. That was the other and last thing I'll say right now before we pass to you is, we did get targets. They were numbers. They're not coordinates. It was just numbers. And we had no idea what we were doing. And certainly when I was doing it, I'm like, wow, this is just like, I feel like I'm just making stuff up. But it was really interesting that nobody had a similar looking page. Nobody. Everybody rendered it differently. But everybody got certain pieces the same. Like they may have rendered the picture different, or the words may have been a little different. But like, for example, we viewed the orb or the drone. That was the second day she gave us a drone number. And none of us, of course, knew that that's what we were doing. And I think the vast majority of the people who shared got a red line. I know over my paper, I had the word red, and this red. And first thing I got was water and something underneath the water, and then this red line going from the water into the sky. I mean, it was so odd when I was driving. I'm like, I have no idea what I'm drawing. But as we watched everybody share, you could totally see the themes. which helped me to understand why it really does make a lot of sense to do it in teams and then to extract the consistent bits.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's kind of like triangulating a location. When you have 3 different references, you can actually get a really precise target. When you only have 1 or 2, it's not going to be as precise. I think also what I lean on here in terms of what would persuade people that we should take this kind of data seriously to begin with is the empirical results that already exist. So we've before discussed Dean Radin is someone who's historically done really great research with really rigorous protocols to demonstrate beyond a shadow of doubt that people have these abilities. It's been demonstrated in labs. There absolutely are some limitations you run into in labs and those kinds of things in terms of reproducibility, certain assumptions that are made about reality that are not quite accurate. But nevertheless, there's a really strong body of evidence. And as I've said, probably on 10 or 20 different podcast episodes, there's like 150 years of parapsychological research supporting this kind of material. So this is not new, even though for people who've been sheltered and living in the conventional kind of thinking, this will seem new to them. Now, of course, another major occurrence recently that completely dovetails with what's happening with the orbs and the drones, which again, I would say is no coincidence. I know you would agree with me. This is all dovetailing towards some convergence, is the arising of the Telepathy Tapes podcast. Now, you and I tackled that pretty early on. It has now become the #1 podcast in the world. It has overtaken Joe Rogan as the most popular podcast. And when you think about the implications of that, you think about things you and I have talked about in terms of this basically is a consensus reality that we are underwriting the plot for and the rules for, all those kinds of things. Then when you suddenly have millions of people every week coming into an awareness about this nature of reality and therefore their own agency to rewrite reality, that has massive implications. And that is arising at just the right timing in the midst of the things we're running into, which are daunting and overwhelming when you take them just by looking at them at the surface, which is another matter we've discussed many times on Event Horizon, a big reason why we started this podcast. Something else I want to touch on is Eric Wargo's work. So he wrote a really great book called Time Loops. I encourage people to read it. And to clarify, Eric Wargo is still a physicalist, but he can't deny as a physicalist that he's experienced, and he's proven it to himself through different protocols, that he has precognitive dreams and that many, many people do. And this proves that linear time is mostly an illusion and that we do have access to the future. Often it's depicting our future, actually, and we kind of deduce certain global events based on our personal future that we're tapping into, which has to do with, again, why group consensus is really important, I think. Now, another piece I want to touch on before we go into the next question is something we touched on already, and this is another reason, perhaps the most compelling for the average person on the street, why you should take this seriously, and that's that the military, the U.S. government has taken this seriously, that the CIA funded programs to do with remote viewing for 20 years. The Stargate program is the one that's most well known. It was also known under other names. It's absolutely still going on. It's just gone into the black and they're using different code names now, but it absolutely is still going on. We know the Soviets did it as well and still do it. In fact, it was the Soviets using it that actually encouraged us to get into it during the Cold War. So let me give a bit of background on the Stargate project, just for the people in the audience who are not quite convinced that this is legitimate kinds of data. Now, the Stargate project was a secret U.S. government program that investigated the potential for remote viewing, which is the ability to perceive or describe details of distant or unseen locations using extrasensory perception. The program was conducted by the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, and later the CIA, running from the early 70s to 1995. Now, some key details here. In terms of origins, the program began, as I just hinted at, in response to reports of Soviet experiments in psychic research during the Cold War. The U.S. sought to determine if psychic phenomena could be harnessed for intelligence and military purposes. And by the way, as a quick aside, the reason why the Soviets were ahead is there was lots of religious resistance to these kinds of notions within the U.S. government. And we only really got in the game once we recognized we might lose the Cold War if we don't try to catch up here. Now, remote viewing involves attempting to see, quote unquote, a location, object, or event that is distant or otherwise inaccessible using only the mind. In other words, you can't use any of your gross senses. It's just mind sight. Participants, referred to as remote viewers, were given coordinates or vague information and tasked with describing the target. Now, in terms of the institutions involved, just to really make this point to the people who are skeptical out there, the Stanford Research Institute, SRI, the early work was done there at Menlo Park in California by scientists like Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ. Various military and intelligence organizations participated at different stages. Now, in terms of applications, remote viewing sessions were reportedly used to locate hostages, identify military installations, uncover hidden weapons or technologies. High-profile claims included describing Soviet submarines and weapons development. I've discussed that before. Finally, in terms of prominent figures, Ingo Swann, Pat Price, Joe McMoneagle. Now, you touched on earlier, we all have this capacity to some degree. Some people seem to have a greater innate degree than others. But interestingly, someone like Joe McMoneagle, and I touched on this on previous podcasts, says that he believes the reason he's good at it is because he had to have this capacity, this sixth sense you might call, while he was growing up on the mean streets of Miami as a little kid, having to take care of his sisters. He needed to know what was around the corner. And so he believes he was actually learning to practice this, exercise this muscle at a very young age, whereas we generally are not. All right, so enough about that. Let's go on to our next question. This is about distortion. So Janis, how does distortion arise when interpreting something that has been gleaned remotely, and how can remote viewers work to minimize this distortion?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really important because the psychology of the human mind is going to distort things. It's just the way it is. It's part of the analytic overlay. We make a lot of presumptions, and part of the way we move so fast through our world, we're able to make a lot of connections very quickly. But it does lead to distortions in terms of the sense that these are basically assumptions, presumptions, preferences and aversions and history. A lot of times I've noticed as a psychologist, there's just a lot of things people don't understand. The biggest challenge for humanity is we don't understand our distortions. So the ones that you know about are ones you can kind of correct for. You're like, oh, I can feel that I don't want it to be that. And so I'm going to make it look something else. The ones that get us are the ones we don't know about. And those typically result from preferences, aversions, experiences, assumptions that are kind of hidden to us. And as you and I know, there's lots of folks in our world, this world, the anomalous world, who believe that because they can see so far and wide in so many ways that it must be correct. And that's an erroneous assumption, because this isn't happening at the mind sight layer. It's happening at the filtration layer. And most of us haven't done a whole lot of work on our distortions. So it's really, really easy to have those built into the results. And I always assume that there's some distortion built in. And I want to say to people too, distortion doesn't necessarily bad. It's kind of the contouring of it. The goal isn't to get rid of all distortions. I'm not even sure that's possible. It's like trying to get rid of your personality. You can't do that while you're here. But it's really good. It's helpful to know what you tend to prefer or not prefer, how you render and how you don't render. Like I heard Birdie say it recently, she was doing remote viewing the drones and she drew a pentagon. And she said, it could be the Pentagon, but I know that my mind will give me a pentagon if it's a symbol for military. So it could just be a military installation. We could talk about that as something of a distortion in the sense that you can't get quite a fix because your mind is using a metaphoric overlay, and that overlay is going to have assumptions sort of built in that are easy to analytically extend if you don't really know your own mind. But I think that makes it really, really important to know your own mind. And it does feel like part of what's happening with remote viewing is it's not getting it right from the outside. It's figuring it out how your mind renders it and delivers it to you. For example, if you're remote viewing for a murder case, as you were talking earlier, I was thinking, that was a great example base. Like there are tons of detective cases, like cold cases, murder cases, and so forth that have been solved through psychic abilities. Most big police departments in the country have used them, hired them for cases. But if you're remote viewing for a murder case and you have a trauma history or something you see is linked to your own, something that is very personal, I suspect that you're going to have to do a lot of work with yourself to understand what the internal reaction is going to be to that image before it ever gets on the page, so that you don't end up distorting it to protect yourself before you render it. I think that's one of the most challenging elements of being that kind of remote viewer. You got to be really, really aware of where your own reflexive tendencies are going to be because of your own history. Basically, really high degree of self-awareness.
Yeah, and some other things I want to add here, and something I think is important to point out in light of what you just said there. We actually learn pattern recognition as young children, and that actually serves us, right? The world is very complex. We're constantly experiencing a barrage of data, even if you just go by what we can perceive with our usual senses. And so our brain learns to recognize patterns and adjust for them so as to protect us and to give us the best life possible. In fact, one of the things I talk about in my classes is recognizing that sometimes the modus operandi we work under was something that we learned as a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. And sometimes that served us for a long time, but maybe now we can approach it differently, and we want to become conscious of those pattern recognitions and the way they skew the way we see the world. This is true of just the way we live, but it's also certainly true for these things as well. So we're not saying that it's bad that we're pattern recognizers. This is actually helpful. But when you come to this kind of work, you want to account for that so that you can try to get more of a clean stream. Something else that's really interesting that was only understood over time with research, because again, this blew people's minds in terms of the nature of reality and the implications, because it turned out not only does it matter that the remote viewer doesn't know the target, but even if the researcher conducting the research knows the target, it can end up biasing the remote viewer because they can pick up the consciousness of the researcher, and that kind of overlay can leak in as well. So now the most rigorous protocols involve even the researchers don't know what the target is, not just the remote viewer. So that's fascinating. It just shows how much there's this porous nature between our consciousness. Something else that's really important in terms of what I would point out to people to look out for right away when it comes to getting off target with remote viewing, and that is memory and imagination. Now, this is surprising to people because they think, isn't that kind of what you're doing with remote viewing? And it's actually not. You're actually seeing. You're seeing without using your eyes. It's mind sight. So what happens is when you're waiting for something to arise, number one, memories will start populating into your mind, and you can make the mistake of thinking, it's that, when actually, no, that's just memory. So patience is really, really important. And imagination is another one, of course. Imagination is a great gift, but you have to be careful to not just in that pausing and waiting in that vacuum, that your imagination doesn't just populate something and you pick that. So eventually, this is why practice is so essential, because you learn to feel those differently. They show up differently energetically in your own system, and you begin to recognize, what does imagination feel like? What does memory feel like? And you learn to control for those to some degree in your practice. Which speaks to another thing I want to get to, which is that you have to let it emerge, not force it. You have to be patient. And in our society that's very much about everything now and constant distractions, that goes against the grain. So you have to be able to develop this muscle over time. It does take patience. Some other things I want to touch on is that you have to report the phenomenological experience without interpretive overlay. This is really important. And people often, if they're not taught this specifically, will not realize this is what they're doing. You may see a shape. Whether or not that's a bird or a plane or something else, you don't know. So you want to sketch basically the outline of the things you're seeing in the rawest way possible. And a good example of this came up in Ingo Swann's really great book, Penetration. I would highly recommend people read that book. There's a time where he's been employed by the US government to remote view the far side of the moon. And he's noticing that there are bases there. And this is very confusing to his logical mind based on his conventional understanding, because his understanding is that we've hardly gone to the moon, let alone actually built bases there. So he's constantly trying to understand what he's seeing and how it can possibly be what looks like man-built structures. And he's actually told numerous times by the researcher, just tell us what you see, don't try to make sense of it. And eventually he begins to put together, this might be an ET base, this is not human built, but that just shows you how much you have to watch out for that. And if you get caught up in that process, you can actually distract yourself from the target. Another thing that matters too is that people will sometimes want to hedge their bets to protect their reputation. They'll sort of lean towards an interpretation they think is most likely because they want to end up getting more hits. You have to trust the process and not rely on your intellect. You have to just really work the process over and over again. The final thing I'll say before turning it back to you, and then we need to move to our final section, is, like I said in the beginning, when it came to me and this nefariousness, this kind of overlay of nefarious forces, partly non-human and human, watch out for your preferred hypotheses or scenarios. Make sure you're controlling for those as well. All right, with all that said, let's move to this final question in light of the circumstances we find ourselves in, where there's this presence of orbs and drones, some human, some apparently non-human. We have these really overwhelming circumstances in the world arising as we speak. We are on the verge, perhaps, of disclosure and final contact, but also this concern about some massive solar flash, some massive solar storm, the potential for nuclear war, geopolitical conflict, boiling over, all those things. So, knowing whatever happens is going to be intense and involve intense energies, what practical practices can we employ to best prepare ourselves?
Well, I think fear is the mind killer, right? Dune, right? Fear is the mind killer. I think that is very, very true. So working with mind is one of the central ways that I help people to do that, because fear comes from inside the mind. As we talked about earlier, it's like, you can dangle that fear stick for me, and if I respond, that's on me. That's not on you. Learning how to work with fear inside is great, and is important. And there are ways to do that through breath, coming present, being able to drill down to what am I really afraid of. If you start unraveling almost all fear, it's fear of death. It's almost always fear of annihilation of some sort, whether it's annihilation of my life, annihilation of something that I care about, things I own. It's ultimately a fear of death. So finding ways to kind of work with that, to just breathe through that, is helpful. If you have a practice, or you have a spiritual belief that includes transcending death, I highly recommend. I think now personally of death as a portal. It's not an ending. I have a portal in through birth. I have a portal out through death. And it's going to happen one point or another. And it's taken me a lot of years to get pretty comfortable with that. And I'm certain that I would still be, there'll still be flashes of fear when it comes. But I think, honestly, if you really want to work it, that's the edge to work. And then the other thing is love. Well, I was told very early, this was I don't know, a few months ago, when I was in meditation and sort of consulting with whatever it is I consult with, my beings, I think of them as. And I was like, how do I get through this gauntlet? It was just so scary. And I was told, love, just if you can stay in a state of gratitude, kindness, compassion for all things, including the darkness, are part of it too, then you lose the charge. You lose the charge that magnetically draws you to the thing you're afraid of. Because what is happening at the electromagnetic level, I think, is we're basically merging with the very thing that we're scared of, because there's charge there. So some form of love in the most robust ways that we don't, not the gooey romantic attachment stuff, which is lovely, but that's not what I mean here. It's just staying in the most expanded state you can. And that's where I learned personally that if you work that death fear edge, it really helps with that. Those are the pieces of advice. And then breath. I do a lot of work with breath work with people and coming present. It's super easy for us to get our minds running out into the future and start spitting all this information. It's not information. They're scary pictures about what's going to happen. But it's not data rich. It's not real information. It's just scary pictures about what's going to happen. If I can stay present, then I'm just responding to what's here right now in my world. And do your best to stay in your body and not completely leave, because then you're not present. Those are some very quick, high-level things that I would recommend. What about you?
Yeah, let me give a few before we sign off here. One thing relates to something you said and something I said earlier, in terms of me preferring to talk about some intelligences as being less developed earlier in their maturation than others, rather than referring to them as good or bad or evil or good, because I find that that's not very helpful, and it also doesn't pull us into agency, because we have to recognize even the dark entities are also source consciousness. There is nothing that is not. So therefore, if we can stay in that perspective, we can actually hold positive intention for their evolution. And that actually puts us in a place where we can stay in love, like you said, even when we're dealing with and thinking about these kinds of entities. So that's one really important piece. Another thing I would say is that life involves this dance between stillness and movement. I would say that we come into the world with a certain energetic expression that wants to resolve itself in our lifetime. But we also need to take plenty of time to tune into the stillness of the undifferentiated sea of consciousness of which we're all a part. That allows us to come back into this space, the relative space, and act in an empowered way, remembering what you pointed to, that we are eternal beings that cannot be destroyed. And again, remember, even Courtney Brown said, the negative entities, the less mature entities know that, and all they can do is distract us. They cannot destroy us. I would also say that it's important to identify a circle of support. Don't do this alone. Try to find people that can help you, that support you, and support each other, because we are more than the sum of our parts. Absolutely. Not just in some mathematical way, but energetically we are. It kind of ramps up, and it's orders of magnitude more powerful. So tap into that as well. Final thing I'll say to highlight something you touched on is absolutely practice this ahead of time. Picture the worst case scenario, put yourself in that situation and work it through energetically. We talk about Olympic athletes will actually practice ahead of time, mentally going through the course they're going to run the next day. They have been proven empirically to do better because of that. We will as well. And it's all about working with energy. So we can work with the energy before the moment ever arises. And on top of that, when we've worked through it already, a lot of the fear just dissipates because we've already worked with some of the energy. A final thing I'll say before we sign off is that for me, I have had a strong sense, because I do have this sense of being a multidimensional being with different lifetimes, that a big part of what I wanted to experience was how I would handle the transition out of this construct, which is to say how I will die in terms of the mortal body. So I am preparing myself for that, because I know that will be one of the most important questions, if not the most important question, in addition to did you love, when I get on the other side. So that's something to keep in mind too. The end game is not just to protect ourselves here. It's to actually fully embody our multi-dimensional potential. So I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we hope you'll tune in again in a few weeks' time for another edition of Event Horizon.